Good morning, everyone. Thank you and happy Transgender Day of Visibility. I am Danielle Binion, Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at KU Medical Center, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next trio of panelists and speakers. We have CJ Genovi, Rachel Locks, and Tory Gleason. CJ Genovi is a veteran journalist with deep roots in the Midwest. She writes columns and edits the opinion section of the Kansas Reflector, part of the National States Newsroom network of nonprofit journalism sites focused on state governments. Prior to joining the Reflector, Genovi served as a digital managing editor and as an arts reporter for KCUR, Kansas City's NPR affiliate. She has also spent more than a decade as editor of The Pitch, Kansas City's alt weekly newspaper. Her book, No Place Like Home, Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas, University Press of Kansas, 2018, won the 2019 Stubendeck Great Plains Distinguished Book Prize and was named a Kansas Notable Book for 2019 and was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award in LGBTQ nonfiction. Rachel Locks is a fourth-year medical student and advocate for transgender rights and healthcare awareness. Rachel was assigned male at birth and came out as a transgender youth during medical school, or an adult during medical school. This transition gave Rachel a unique perspective on strides that have been made for transgender health, as well as areas for improvement. Rachel is an entrepreneur who is passionate about renewable energy and electric aviation. Rachel co-founded an aerospace startup called Happy Takeoff, where women are empowered through leading edge electronic aviation technology. Rachel is enthusiastic about providing transgender youth hope, direction, and opportunity. Dr. Tory Gleason is certified by the American Chiropractic Board of Sports Physicians. She earned her chiropractic degree from Palmer College of Chiropractic and then went on to earn her sports diploma. She's currently in the MPH program at KUMC Wichita campus with a clinical focus on rural health access as well as health equity of LGBTQ plus populations. In addition to working with high school and college athletes, her clinical focus is on transgender and gender expansive patient populations. She has been in hospital governance and leadership the last 10 years with Centura Health, Goodland Regional Medical Center, working in rural health and building a sustainable network of hospitals in the region. Tory has passion for serving in the diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI space with the Masonic Cancer Alliance, as well as Equality Kansas Research and Education Foundation and the rest of the state. CJ, Rachel, and Tory, welcome. CJ.
Hi, everyone. My name is CJ Genovi. I'm a cisgender lesbian. I'm happy to be with you today, though not in person. I'm sorry I'll miss my fellow presenters' comments and the conversation. I think what I can bring is just a little bit of history based on what I learned while researching my book, No Place Like Home, Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. It follows about a decade of surprising progress, starting around 2005 when Kansans passed a statewide constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. After that, activists organized all around the state. They worked for non-discrimination ordinances in places like Hutchinson and Salina and Manhattan, and they fought anti-LGBT legislation at the State House. Some of the most visible leaders of this effort were trans women. Sandra Mead on the left was the statewide chair of Equality Kansas. That's the statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. She was in that role beginning in 2013. She was a very visible presence, leading rallies. Here you see her on the State House steps and being the spokesperson in news coverage. Stephanie Mott, who you see on the right, was board chair of Equality Kansas, and she did this amazing thing in July 2011. So almost a decade ago, she drove that little car all around the state of Kansas stopping to engage strangers in conversations, asking people randomly what they knew about transgender. What she found out was that the people of Kansas are a lot more open-minded than their politicians. She also realized that they needed a lot of education. So she gave hundreds of presentations around the state to anyone who listened: Sunday school classes, college classes, brown bag luncheons for corporations. She died unexpectedly in March of 2019, but by then, I think she'd really helped educate the whole state. One of the people she worked closely with was Luke Ben Simone, who you see here at the microphone with Nyla Foster, who I think you'll hear from later. They were two of the plaintiffs who sued the state to be able to correct the gender markers on their birth certificates. They won that case in 2019. And here you see Luke with Stephanie Mott at the Kansas Capitol. This is in 2019, just a few weeks before Stephanie died. Every year for many years now, there's an Equality Day at the Capitol where LGBTQ folks show up and meet with lawmakers and hold a rally. It's organized by Tom Witt, the director of Equality Kansas. And in the picture on the right, Stephanie Mott's holding an executive order signed by Laura Kelly in 2019, reinstating protections for LGBTQ state employees in Kansas. Kathleen Sebelius originally made that executive order. Sam Brownback reversed it. Laura Kelly reinstated it. So that was a happy day. Every year at these rallies, you see busloads of kids coming to Equality Day. These are middle schoolers and high schools chaperoned by GLSEN, the Wichita chapter of an organization that works to create safe schools. So another mark of progress is this year, for the first time, we have a transgender member of the Kansas legislature. Stephanie Byers was elected. Here you see her given one of those speeches during Equality Day in 2017. She was elected in this past November, which is just in time to fight a couple of really damaging bills that have been proposed in the legislature this year. One would make it a crime for any healthcare provider to provide services to trans people under 18. That bill seems to have died in committee, but it could always get revived. The other bill that's getting a lot of action is Senate Bill 208, which would ban trans girls and women from participating on women's sports teams. This is part of a national movement. There are 20 of these bills around the country, and it's resulted in a lot of extremely damaging statements being made at the State House. It seems on its way to passing. I don't know what might have happened between when I recorded this and when you're hearing it, but it's bad that lawmakers are even considering it. So the point I'm trying to make is that policy is healthcare. The people we elect are literally making life and death decisions for trans people. Right now, we're in a very dangerous backlash. I know long term we'll keep making progress, but it requires work. So I'll leave you at that, except to say that, again, I'm sorry I can't have a conversation. If you want to reach me at any time, just send me a note, cj@cjjanovy.com. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, I guess it's my turn now to speak. Thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm really happy to be amongst such friendly faces. So many names I recognize, either friends in real life or names that I know from email correspondence. And it's just so great to see such a great group of people together here today. So thanks for having me. On this Transgender Day of Remembrance, I just wanted to briefly talk about one of my heroes. Her name is Martine Rothblatt. She was the founder of Sirius XM Radio and a medical company called United Therapeutics, where they're making strides in autologous organ transplants. She's a transgender woman. She transitioned roughly 20 years ago, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to call her my friend. And one of the things that she says is that one of her big missions was to make the world a better place for her seedlings. And what she means by that is the next generation of transgender people. So I'm one of her seedlings, and I like Tory said, and this is something that she and I have talked about before, I consider myself very fortunate as well. Being a transgender person, I still have had an amazing support structure and amazing friends that have helped me get through medical school. And so I see it as kind of my responsibility to make the world a better place for the generation that follows me and improve the healthcare for them. So why is it important to discuss things like we're discussing today, transgender healthcare? Well, again, to reference Tory's speech earlier, she mentioned the suicidal behavior. And to quote a meta-analysis from the Indian Journal of Psychological Medicine, the suicide attempt rate among transgender persons ranges from 32 to 50% across all countries. And in my own personal experience, that seems like an underrepresentation, because almost every transgender person I know has had some experience, whether it's an attempt or ideation, and myself included. That's what precipitated me coming out as transgender and transitioning, which I did during medical school. That wasn't easy, but it was a chance for me to increase awareness among future healthcare providers. So I am very grateful for that opportunity. The article goes on to say that gender-based victimization, discrimination, bullying, violence, being rejected by the family, friends, and community, harassment by intimate partners, family members, police, and public, and discrimination and ill treatment at healthcare systems are the major risk factors that influence this suicidal behavior among transgender persons. So it's incredibly important to have these kind of discussions today. And as a person who's transgender and part of the medical community, when I was asked to speak today, I wasn't sure if I should talk about my own experience or something more on the medical side. And just kind of in the current political atmosphere, I thought it could be interesting to kind of discuss the genetics that are involved in gender identity. Something I've noticed lately when it comes to basic human rights is that a lot of people seem to be genetics experts, and they're for the most part woefully ill-informed. So I just wanted to dig into that a little deeper. So what are chromosomes? Chromosomes are a set of DNA, which DNA is essentially a blueprint that tells our bodies how to make proteins, and hormones are proteins. So there's, the female configuration you would consider to be XX, traditionally speaking, or XY is thought to be a male presentation. But that said, there are many different factors that go into building something between the blueprint and the final product. So just a few examples. There are a couple of different abnormalities that people can be born with. One is called Klinefelter Syndrome. It's when they get two copies of the X chromosome and a copy of the Y chromosome. And these patients will typically, they'll be assigned male at birth, and then they will develop more feminine traits. Another one is called Turner syndrome, and in that syndrome, the person only gets one X chromosome. But the way the genetics works, it's a blueprint that's transcribed into something called RNA. RNA is a transcript, so essentially a paper blueprint for the cells of your body to read and know what to do. And so there's another condition I'd like to just kind of briefly talk about. It's called androgen insensitivity disorder. And as a medical student, if I'm practicing for an exam and they ask a question about this, they'll say that the patient was assigned female at birth, grew up to about puberty age, and then just didn't have a period when she was supposed to. On further investigation, you will find that this person who was assigned female at birth actually has an XY chromosome configuration. The reason that they are assigned female at birth and they develop as a female in utero is because the receptors on the cells can't pick up testosterone. So they can have all the testosterone in the world floating into their bloodstream, but their body just doesn't see it. So in the kind of political climate today, where people want to define gender based on chromosome configuration, I don't think you can really tell one of these patients that was born female and grew up as female, sorry, you have a Y chromosome, so you're a male. The Y chromosome contains a gene that's called the Sry gene, and that gene, it tells the proteins that are built, the hormones, that, hey, we're making a male body here. And as a transgender woman, I always appreciated that the name of the gene was Sry. It sounds like it was apologizing to me, like, sorry about the penis. Anyway, I digress. That's, I think, a great example of why chromosome configuration does not correlate to gender identity. So what about genetics with transgender individuals? What makes us transgender? What gives us that gender dysphoria? Well, when we're developing in the womb, in the first trimester, that's when we develop our genitals, several of their physical traits. And it's not until the second trimester that we start to develop our brain. And hormones are what tells us how to grow in a certain way. So there's one hypothesis that, unfortunately, we do need a lot more research done in this arena, but there's a hypothesis that if there's variations in mom's hormones during the second trimester, you might be developing a male fetus. And then when it comes time to build a brain, maybe some of those hormones from mom get in and the receptors somehow get the wrong blueprints. And they think, okay, we're making a female brain, but the rest of the body didn't get the message, unfortunately. So, and there's scientific research that kind of backs up that hypothesis. And what I mean is, for the anatomy of the brain, there are certain characteristic traits that you can see in cisgendered male versus cisgendered female brains. One of those is in an area called the stria terminalis. This area is very involved in anxiety. And in a couple of different research efforts that they've done, they've analyzed the structure of that part of the brain in cis male and cis female people, and they find distinctive patterns. Now, if you look at that part of the brain in a transgender woman, it matches that of a cisgendered woman, not a cisgendered man. So there is an observable anatomical difference in transgender people that supports the hypothesis that, it's not just something that they're confused about or that we're confused about. So that's just kind of my brief little 10-minute truncated version of genetics as it pertains to gender dysphoria and in being transgender, or having different gender identity implications. So
thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, of course. Very happy to talk, but I think that's about it for my time. I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. We'll hold questions toward the end, and then we'll have Tory speak next.
Thanks for having me back again. I know I'm extra, so I'll try and keep this short and truncated because, well, I just identify as extra. So anyhow, I just want to, as a Kansan, as a trans person from Kansas, I just want to identify with, or just call attention to the fact that the queer and trans people of color and what they've done for us. For Marsha P. Johnson, to Luke, to Nyla, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them and their work, their advocacy. Like, listen, we know that the first Pride Parade started as a riot. And we understand that because of the work of Stephanie and Nyla and Luke, because of their work, I was able to get my birth certificate changed. I wouldn't have been able to do that unless they'd said enough is enough. And so I'm just grateful to be here. And again, we don't give enough attention to the queer people of color and trans people of color that that have allowed us to be where we are today. And I think that's important from a DEI perspective to state that I am privileged because of their fights, privileged because of their battle. And I'm also privileged to just listen and geek out over Rachel speaking. And I identify with that SRY aspect. That's pretty good. And so I think it's important to have conversations that it is tough. We do have a lot of work to do. And there's so much misunderstanding, you know, when a lot of the people it's complicated. A lot of people's understanding of biology doesn't really expand beyond 5th grade. And that's a challenge to have conversations with people in public or Facebook or Twitter. And so, which can actually be a really hard place where you just have to unplug and just focus on self-care, because otherwise you could be pretty beat up. But I really believe that the panelists today, I am geeking out over this symposium today, and I'm very appreciative of everyone here. But I know we're running out of time, and so I will talk too much. So I want to make sure people get the questions and so forth. So.
Thank you, Tory. And I have some questions for you and Rachel. Rachel, are you still on with us?
Yep, I'm right here.
Great. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that. But one first question we have is, what are some steps towards making the world better for the next generation? Rachel, you talked about the seedlings and really putting forth effort to make the world better. So what are some tangible next steps that we all can do towards that effort?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things is just educating. And, you know, as a medical professional, for me, it's to reduce morbidity and mortality within transgender community. And I'll give you an example of, you know, we talked about the suicidal behavior amongst this population, but there's also an increase in morbidity. And what that means is in sickness. And an example is a good friend of mine who, I'm saying seedlings. I don't know what seedlings means. So yes, I'd like to tell you about a patient of mine. They've given me permission to kind of tell their story as it pertains to morbidity. I was doing a rotation on the pediatric ICU unit, and I had a little transgender kiddo patient come in. And when I'm on a rotation and I see someone who's transgender, they become mine. They're my property after that. So this kiddo, he's a trans male, and he had a very advanced case of Crohn's disease. And it had progressed so far that by the time he came in, he was in very, very bad shape. And the surgeon, the pediatric surgeon on the case, said it was the worst case of Crohn's that she'd ever seen. And so in kind of talking to this patient and finding out why did you wait so long to ask for help? Because you've had this disease for a long time. It's because he didn't feel comfortable going to health professionals. And I think that's really sad. And just having someone who could advocate for him, it made such a huge impact on his clinical course and how his confidence was, you know, versus when he came in and when he left. And I'm really proud of him. He's an amazing kid. I still stay in touch with him and his mom. His mom and I went to high school together, incidentally. So, but I think that is kind of an example of you know, how morbidity can be affected by gender dysphoria, or being transgender, being different. And it comes back to the study that I mentioned earlier that stated that treatment at healthcare systems, along with discrimination, is a major factor for not just suicidal behavior, but mental health as a whole. So to me, you know, I'm kind of unique in that I have a foot in the transgender community and the healthcare community. So I feel like it's my responsibility to help educate and help further understanding within the healthcare community, as far as, you know, how everyone else can impact just the general acceptance of trans youth moving forward. I think educating, you know, just talking, destigmatizing, being transgender isn't there's not something wrong with you. It's just it's just you. And there's so many people that just don't understand. So I think really just helping further that understanding is the most important thing that we can be doing.
Thank you, Rachel. Tory, you unmuted. Do you have something to share there too?
I just wanted to say, in terms of allyship, in terms of advocacy, take Ryan's class, take Lynn's class, get engaged, start filling those up. We all ought to make sure that we are continually adding to the conversation, adding to, as we continue to change the curriculum, we continue to look at the language we use around diversity, the language we use around inclusivity, making sure that we're engaging in conversation. And I think that's the important thing, that whether you're a KUMC employee or a student, I don't care which campus, pick a campus, all of us should make sure we're going through that curriculum. That ought to be required, if you ask me. Unconscious bias ought to be required. Making sure that we're going through the advocacy and ally training, making sure that we're I mean, these are our coworkers, our fellow students, our friends, our family, our parents. And so the more of that we can engage in conversation, I think the better off we're going to be. And so I just really want I can't thank Rachel enough. She's a rock star and I appreciate her. And also a bigger nerd than I am, which I really appreciate.
Thank you.
I appreciate you both sharing those very poignant stories. We do have a question in the chat. It is from Lisa Green, and she's asking, or they are asking, how do you explain they have struggled to explain things like Klinefelter Syndrome and Sry Gene or protein to family and friends. How do you explain that in layman's terms for people who don't understand past middle school biology?
I've heard the kind of the same concepts explained once by a psychiatrist who I really like how he put it. He used an analogy where all the different kind of moving parts between the genetic code for proteins and then how proteins work. He used an analogy that, if I can remember correctly, it would be like a foreman on a building site. So the foreman would be the hormone, because the hormone is what directs the cellular proliferation development. And then the blueprint would be the genetics. And in practicality and in real life, if you have so many moving parts between blueprint and the final product, whatever the building is. So you have to take the blueprint, it has to be interpreted by the foreman. The foreman directs what happens, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong in that process. Like they can misread the blueprint, or they can get the wrong blueprint. So if you can just find a way to kind of correlate that information into an analogy that people without a medical education can understand, I think that would be the best advice I have.
Thank you both so very much for sharing your story again, for giving us an opportunity to educate ourselves in this moment. If you can please put in the chat any resources, whether they're books or articles on gender, on genetics and biological development, that was a request, and a link to the research that you shared in the chat. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Lucy, are you there? You're up.
I am. Hello, and thank you for coming today. We are blessed to have two special speakers on cultural perspectives. One is Joshua Chojole. He enjoys driving context-relevant strategic advocacy, which he pursues through research, strategic engagement, capacity and strengthening, and is grounded, his approach is grounded in social justice, centering on marginalized communities and seeking to subvert and dismantle oppressive power dynamics. Joshua is inspired by African feminist, decolonial ideals and values and meaningful partnerships rooted in community that recognize individual and communal well-being as political priorities. Some of his current passions have included and are serving as peer reviewer for the Other Foundation, a member for the Center of Human Rights Legal Task Team on the Semenya case, participating in the SOC 8 reform process by the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. He's grateful for the amazing activists who have walked before him and those who walk with him, supporting and nurturing by his family and community and the guidance of his ancestors and the continual presence of the divine grace. Our other speaker is Korea Kelly, a native Kansas City, Missourian, eldest sister of 4 siblings and wife of loving husband of 13 years. They have 2 fur babies, Koa, and Bella. Korea has a rich background in LGBTQIA advocacy and leadership, trans health, and entertainment. She is the first Black trans woman in Kansas City to own and operate a successful business and has facilitated many local trans support groups that focus on providing access to tangible resources. She is better known to the community as Korea Cavalli, founder of the Cavalli Entertainment LLC, established in 1998, and the Trans Empowerment Society, established in 2019. Since 15 years old, she has embarked on her Black Kansas City LGBTQIA community as an open-hearted person who wants to make a difference in her community. In addition, she is one of the leading Kansas City historians of local Black and Brown queer culture. Welcome our 2 speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, and hi everyone. Just give me 1 second, yeah. Cool, so today I'm going to be talking to you about, or giving you a decolonial perspective to healthcare, to trans healthcare in particular. Thank you. So I'm just going to give you some definitions, and then I'm going to talk about colonialism in healthcare and kind of biomedical categorization, and hopefully demonstrate to you why depathologization, which I think you heard about from the earlier session on human rights perspectives, is a decolonial imperative. So pathologization and depathologization, I mean, fairly simple. The one is, pathologization is just to treat something as a medical disorder, and depathologization is to affirm something as naturally occurring diversity, as not an indicator of illness. And when I talk about colonization, I rely particularly on Bohan's discussion of the stages of colonialism in Africa. And he talks about how colonialism in Africa went from an occupation of land to an occupation of being. And he speaks specifically about metacolonialism, which is a key factor in determining globalized ideals and understandings of the world. So the things that we just think of as kind of like international fact or standard are often rooted in a particular cultural European tradition, a historical European philosophical tradition, scientific tradition, political European political tradition of thought and practice. And so there was no kind of, because of the history of colonialism, there was no multicultural basis in the genesis and the development of global ideals. as they are embodied today in the international political system, economic system, social system. And this has profound effect on how we understand different classifications, biological classifications. And it also has a profound effect on systems that organize society. So the educational system, the medical system, and so on. And so when I talk about decolonization, I'm talking about kind of deconstructing the way in which international norms are used to perpetuate particular hierarchies that reinforce kind of this Eurocentric basis in order to develop an alternative normative basis that does not kind of produce and reproduce harm. So in terms of, so that's it for definitions. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about colonialism and healthcare, and the relationship between kind of medicine and bodies, the relationship, kind of the developmental context of gender classification in medicine is something that we need to kind of invest in understanding in the same way that we invest in understanding human rights considerations or socioeconomic and other political considerations. Healthcare takes place from within like a meta medical framework that guides how we think of components like medical knowledge, the organization of medical knowledge, and medical practice. And like I said before, of course, 5 years of expansion have established Western civilization in hegemonic position. And so the international kind of understandings of healthcare as a separate entity, distinct from other social institutions, the way in which we think of disease itself, and the orientation of the health system as existing primarily to eliminate disease, these aren't kind of, well, then that's the international perspective today, but it's very much kind of a Western biomedical approach to healthcare as a system. There are other healthcare systems. Many indigenous cultures, including my own, kind of think of healthcare as a more holistic, concept that encompasses spiritual, physical, behavioral, communal, environmental components. And that is centered on harmony and well-being, not necessarily the elimination of disease. So you will hear a lot of people kind of who oppose depathologization, dismissing or rather relying on this kind of Western notion of, if there is no disease to eliminate, if you are not diseased, if being trans is not a disorder, then why urgently give you healthcare? Because they understand it as, kind of primarily as there to eliminate disease. But of course, as I said, it's not the only conceptualization of, it's not the only health system that exists, just the dominant one. And it positions itself as the thing kind of that can be used to make these objective assertions, right? As something that is untainted. When we say biological, scientific, what we want to say is like real, right? Like factual, untainted by kind of all these social things and so on. But of course, the historical development of biomedicine kind of belies these assertions. So we know that medicine can and does reflect the values of society generally around race, class, gender, age, etc. And this means that we need to continue to kind of examine medicine, the social and cultural construction of medicine, in order to refine medical practice in a way that celebrates diversity. And yeah, I think it's something you can't run away from, the fact that health and illness are based on kind of cultural ideologies of
selfhood, and which is connected to, what is a healthy and moral body. So I just want to kind of give a few examples on race, sexuality, and gender to just explain this a bit better. So when we think about race as an idea, it of course didn't exist before colonization. It emerged as a tool for responding to difference in ways that justified colonial violence, dispossession, and exploitation on a biological basis. So when Europeans landed in the Americas or in South Africa, for example, then you saw these justifications come to kind of you saw these justifications emerge around how African people are akin to lobotomized Europeans, these measurements of brain and of the skull and so on. You saw kind of severe psychopathology being declared in enslaved people who were trying to escape plantations, and an assertion that Africanness itself is a pathological condition, an inferior condition that needs correction, guidance, and management through submitting itself to, white domination. And so medicine as a field developed within this context. And you can see it as well as it relates to gender. When it comes to the history of women and medicine, there's a long history of kind of discrimination in gynecology and psychiatry and so on. You can just look at the diagnosis of hysteria and all the history around that and social kind of control that emerged from that. And when you talk about sexuality, we don't need to look too far. We can just look at the DSM, at the ICD, where homosexuality was declared a mental illness, and subsequently kind of removed from that. And then you see kind of the beginning of the pathologization of gender identity. And there's this kind of ingrained belief in psychiatry about the inherently pathological nature of gender nonconformity. And this belief demands expression through shifting, evolving into ever more niche diagnosis to endure. And that's what you see with the current kind of classifications on gender identity, disorder in childhood, and that kind of thing. But I won't dwell too much on that. Because I do need to wrap up. So what I kind of just want you to, what I wanted you to understand is that medicine kind of, draws on power to pronounce health and illness and lend legitimacy to the policing of deviation. For me, the biomedical framework, it continues to reproduce the manner in which the encounters between colonizer and other people led to this construction of a physical, spiritual, etc., other who needs to be subjugated and controlled. And when we look at diagnostic criteria that trans people have historically been kind of required to match in terms of their sexuality, their dress, their behavior, what they need to do to tick the boxes to be able to get the treatment, it puts cisgender and heterosexual people as the ideal that we need to conform to. And it inherently excludes diversity celebrating multicultural basis that allows people to really be celebrated in their own personal and communal context, because diagnostic standards require adherence, they require conformity, they require you to fit. And so that's where I'll end, just with saying that depathologize, for me, it's really hard to reconcile a pathologizing approach with a decolonial approach. And we need to kind of critically evaluate how
power in medicine operates, so that we can redistribute it in a way that is more just and equitable, in a way that centers marginalized people. And yeah, I'll leave it there and hand back over to the KU team.
Thank you so much. A beautiful analysis, Joshua. Korea Kelly is up next.
There we go. I'm off mute finally. I hope everyone's having a great afternoon. Nice to see everybody, and I'm glad to be a part of this panel. I wanted to talk, a lot of people on here that do know me or do not know me, I do a lot of activism in Kansas City for our Black and Brown community. But today with this special topic, I definitely wanted to hit home a little bit more with the trans community and about our bodies. Sometimes we don't get to know about our bodies and we don't get to ask questions about our bodies or things like that. So for me, when I think about trans health and being invited to this symposium, when I think of trans health, especially trans health for us trans people in Kansas City, I think about all of us, not just Black and Brown in Kansas City. That's the community that I work with most of all, but I think about all of us in the community. There are things as trans people that we don't get a chance to ask questions to our caretakers. Sometimes we want to ask those questions coming from them. A lot of times trans health has to do with the mental capability of trans and GNC folk, especially in Black and Brown community. We don't get a chance to have that mental capability to talk with our care facilities, our caretakers, our doctors about our mental health. And sometimes that mental health plays a part in resources, the capabilities of even functioning on a daily basis, or it's just everything that plays into our lives. Sorry, on my end, I'm having a lag. In Kansas City, we're trying to, in Kansas City, with that, creating the trans support groups and services so far.
I think Miss Korea Kelly is having a little issues with her internet. I know she had just arrived in Phoenix a few minutes before she joined us. She had flown there. Korea, could you try turning your microphone on but keeping your video off? Sometimes that helps when we're having trouble. And then if all of our panelists could go ahead and turn your video off, sometimes that also helps. So we'll just give this a try. So Korea, maybe just turn your speaker on and keep your video off. You want to try that?
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can. That's great.
Awesome. So sorry about that. I'm all over the place. Sorry about that. So to start over, a little about me is I have activism in Kansas City and experience in my background. But what I want to talk about today at the symposium was about knowing our trans bodies. Being who we are as Black and Brown, or as trans people period here in Kansas City, a lot of questions I get as an advocate is how can we help? How can we do this? How can we help the trans community. Sometimes it's not always about hormones or getting to a actual doctor about hormones or anything like that. Sometimes trans folk need the mental capability of mental health, just to talk to someone. They need resources and availability so they can sustain and have a great life and to be able to live their life sufficient without depending on others. To me, when I think of, like I said, thinking of trans health, those are things that I see that comes up very, very, very often. Is people wanting to understand that when they walk into different doctors' offices or clinics or whoever their care person is, that they're being taken care of and that person knows their body. For me in Kansas City, I have teamed up with Operation Liberation, which is a Black bailout fund here in Kansas City. Since 2008, Black trans women and Latinx trans women have been killed in Kansas City. Two people per year for the last year since 2008. The last murder we had here in Kansas City was September the 18th of 2020 of Ariane Burnett, which her killer is still out on the loose. I mentioned that to say this. Again, when we talk about mental capability, sometimes it's not just hormones or things like that, or I got to see a doctor to know my body because I'm going through things. Black and brown trans folks go through a lot of things differently, and it's mainly their resource and their mental health leading up into their transition. Black and brown trans women don't have the opportunity to live out their life until 50 years old and decide that now I am going to be trans and this is the direction that I'm going. So for Black and brown trans people, mental health and mental illness is something that needs to be talked about, something that needs to be addressed, something from not only our perspective as telling our doctors, we're also finding out physicians and things to know back our bodies and things when we go into the office. As of 2018, Dee Darnell Pearson was the first Black trans woman killed here in Kansas City. And since then, we have been fighting and fighting and fighting to try to get resources here in the city. I would tell people who are looking to help in any type of way, shape, form, or fashion to definitely reach out to myself or any of the ladies that were already on panel. I think Rachel and a couple other people that were here already on panel to talk about today.
Mrs. Correa, are you still there? Lucy, I wonder if you want to go on to the Q&A, and if anybody has any questions or comments for Mrs. Kelly or for Joshua, if you can put that in the chat, or you could also use the Q&A function.
We can do that. Does anyone have any questions thus far of Joshua or Miss Correa Kelly?
I do. Do you mind if I just ask it orally, Lucy, rather than typing it
Go right
in?
ahead. Go right ahead.
Joshua, can you talk to us a little bit about your personal experience in South Africa and maybe any comparisons you know to your situation compared to in the United States and some of the cultural differences? And you can put, there you go.
I mean, okay, I guess in terms of the cultural differences, it is, the thing is that the medical system here, or the medical system everywhere, as I said, it's kind of orientated in a particular way. It understands gender from a particular lens. It understands gender diversity from a particular lens. And then it gets here and it's meant to serve people who are living in a very different cultural or kind of social context where so when you still had homosexuality as a disorder in the ICD, one of the and I'm going to forget all my medical jargon now. But one of the diagnostic factors that you had to check in order to rule someone out of being in order for someone to qualify as being trans, is that they needed to have, you know, all these kind of additional factors that related only to their gender expression and gender identity, because sexuality is seen as separate from gender identity. And so even when you talk about global LGBT activism, in activism, we often speak about sexual orientation versus gender expression versus gender identity, and all these being different components that lead to different embodied identities. But this is, of course, based on a particular kind of like Western understanding of the notions of sexuality and gender and sex. Here, there's a more holistic understanding of things being really kind of like, things being really, those kind of components really intersecting with each other in a way that in the movement, in the LGBT movement in South Africa, in the nascent movement, we found when we started to have community dialogues, especially at some point I was volunteering for Transgender and Intersex Africa, which works mainly in rural areas and townships here. And when we were trying to explain to people that, you know, transgender men are not just super lesbians or something like that, that there is that there, you know, that they, you know, when we came there with all this kind of language we learned from the global human rights movement, from the global LGBT movement, and trying to explain these identities as distinct, a lot of the times people just kind of met us with blank stares, because it was like, you know, what you're saying doesn't kind of match up with this more integrated understanding that exists on the ground of the components of sex, gender, and sexuality that are not like these things that are so severed from each other and just exist alone. But that, yeah, definitely interact with each other. And then of course you have, you know, kind of people in the more urban areas that do relate very much with these terms, that do relate very much with the identities as they're kind of globally and internationally understood. But you also have people who have a lot more cultural, spiritual understandings of different in sexuality and so on. And so for them, for example, there's a lot of, it's being trans or being queer is in some indigenous kind of cultures seen as something that's a spiritual, that's part of a spiritual calling. So there's a friend of mine, for example, Tebogo, who founded Trans and Intersex Africa actually, and they understood it in his community as the spirit of his grandfather having called him, which meant he needed to go through a particular initiation process. And he was accepted because it was understood from that kind of spiritual perspective. And you also find it very common to have people who are spiritually called to be to engage in what from a Western perspective would look like a lesbian relationship, for example, but which is really your spiritual ancestor who has a particular desire that you are embodying because they are communicating through you, and that can be a temporary moment, and that you can be married and you can be heterosexual and you can have a wife or a spiritual wife. And so the experiences in terms of the cultural differences is obviously having this medical standard that has this particular kind of understanding of gender means that people then have to do a lot of pretense when they get to the office and they're looking for help. When they get to a medical office, and then they need to conform to this diagnostic criteria that says you must have this particular experience. Yeah.
The diagnostic seems so dehumanizing especially when you put it and compare it to that spiritual perspective, Joshua.
Joshua and Ms. Kelly, we have a question in the chat for both of you. What excites you today, the changes and movements related to the transgender advocacy?
I'm gonna go first. What excites me right now is finally, after years and years and years and years and years of us trans advocates who have been fighting this fight for a decade at least, are finally getting our just due deserve. We're able to be at the forefront. We're actually operating and running our own trans businesses. They're trans-led. They're not led by others trying to fight for us and not really fighting for us. So I'm excited that we as trans folk and GNC folk are leading our own organizations for trans people rather than other people trying to tell us what trans bodies need. So for me, that is extremely exciting. Very, very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo some of that. I think that when I first came out, there was only one trans-led, no, it wasn't even trans-led. There was only one trans-focused kind of organization in the region. And today there is the Southern African Trans Forum, there's the East African Trans Forum, there's a West African Trans Forum. There is a lot of organizing happening where before we just never thought it was even conceivable. There's a lot of legal wins that we're having. There was, of course, in Botswana, the High Court case where two trans people were allowed to change their gender identity on their documents. They even in countries like Kenya, where there's still criminalization of homosexuality, there's still some wins. There are courts ruling in favor of trans people to be able to change their names on their certificates from high school, despite the kind of legal environment. And there are trans people coming together to kind of find out, to kind of develop a system of ensuring access, of distributing binders across the continent, of coming up with creative ways to provide healthcare. I think now we've had like maybe 3 or 4 trans health conferences so far, and for the first time we're talking about whether it's possible to have it outside of South Africa in another country. And so I think that definitely the growing movement is exciting. And then for me, I'm personally kind of particularly into just seeing a reclaiming of kind of African approaches to advocacy and to trans advocacy, queer advocacy, and identity. Things that are really contextual and that are grown from here.
I see there's another question in the chat for me. Someone asked, Ms. Kelly, thank you for your presentation. Are murders and assaults of LGBTQIA individuals in Kansas/Kansas City considered hate crimes? Have any of the previous murders, to answer that question, no, none of them has. On top of our trans girls that have been murdered in Kansas City, on top of the 8 of them, if you would turn around and add 4 more of those colored people to that murder list, will be Black LGBT men in the Kansas City area. My son, Deontay Green, was murdered Halloween night by 2 individuals that are incarcerated, but they have not been charged for a hate crime. All the different murders that we have had in the Kansas City area, metropolitan area, none of those have been charged as a hate crime. We have tried our best to get that pushed, but we have not had any help whatsoever from any of the people that could help us in getting that done. I don't want to put anyone out on blast, but no one has helped with that. All the crimes are not labeled as hate crimes. They're just labeled as murders. And then instead of them getting the highest murder charge, they're getting very low murder charges for these murder charges, the ones that are being convicted.
Thank you for that response. Do we have any other questions from our for our panelists?
We are waiting for a question from Sylvester. I think Sylvester was going to type it into the chat.
Okay.
So let's. In the meantime, Mrs. Correa, Kelly, or Joshua, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I do real quick, because I was just going to say that. I will say this for those of you that are listening out there. I work with Operation Liberation. That's operation-liberation.org. I will also drop it in the chat. Trans Empowerment Society. We have moved to what we call Freedom House, which is in Kansas City, Missouri, in the Northeast community area, where most of the Black trans women have been getting murdered. My office is currently down in that neighborhood, in that area, trying to help those less marginalized in our trans community. So if there's anyone out there that'd like to donate or even come and donate your time or anything like that, please check out operation-liberation.org, or you definitely can catch us on Facebook, Operation Liberation, the Trans Empowerment Society. Those are all on Facebook. We do need help. Again, like I stated earlier, Ariane Burnett's killer is still out there on the loose. Myself, as well as my siblings, as well as their family, are putting posters up and doing everything we can. And anyone with any information of Ariane Burnett's murder on September the 18th of 2020 will be great.
I do have, I think you may have answered some. Korea, what are the ways we can also help with Kansas City Violence Project? It's a little more specific.
You guys will have to definitely reach out to KCABP on your own. I'm not employed there, but they do have programs and services that you definitely can reach out. I'm currently employed by KC Care Clinic. I'm the lead prevention specialist over at KC Care, and I'm also the founder and curator of the new Trans Empowerment Society. So if you guys would like to help out as far as our trans, Black, and brown community, definitely you can donate on the Operation Liberation page and more information. And you can also send me email as well.
And one more question, Miss Kelly. What are the steps you took to become such a fierce advocate or activist? I'm sorry.
To be frank and honest, and anyone knows me, I'm very honest. I'm a Black trans woman born and raised in a native of Kansas City, Missouri. It took me to literally get trained outside of the city of Kansas City, outside of the state of Missouri, in order to understand my trans community. People here in the Kansas City area told me no, they didn't want to help me, they didn't want to push, they didn't want to care about our trans community. They still really don't care about our trans community, they only care about the youth, and it's more than just the youth. We forget about those once they get past 18 and older. Those are the time the trans people need your help the most. From that 18 and older bracket, that is the time that they need you the and helping them in their journey. I'll just leave it at that.
Appreciate that. Any other questions?
Lucy, someone asked Joshua and Mrs. Kelly about who we should follow on social media if we want to understand the trans community better. We want to become more informed and be more active allies. Could you help us with that?
Here in Kansas City, I would tell you to follow these people in Kansas City. Myself, Korea Kelly, Samantha Ruggles, Marie Jensen, Nyla Foster, Kelly New, Cece Glasgow. I can tell you so many people to follow that are trans leaders in this community. We as a Kansas City trans community, we don't look at color. Society and everyone else separates us by color. Here in Kansas City, I can honestly say our trans community is one. We are one mind, one body, one sound, and we love each other, and we try to help each other as a community. So I would tell you to check out Samantha Ruggles, Kelly New, Marie Jensen, Nyla Foster, myself. Go to a show every third Wednesday of the month at Queen Priscilla's. There's a trans and GNC show put on by myself, Priya Cavalli. I bring out the hottest new talent in Kansas City for LGBT, for trans and GNC. So please definitely come out. There's ways to support. Get from behind your computers and your phone calls and your Zooms, and COVID is starting to get better and things like that. Get out in your community and actually help and actually do the things. Dollars and money and things like that is fine, but actually get in your community and actually do the work and help those voices raise.
Okay, we are running close out of time.
Lucy, can I read a comment real quick?
Sure.
We do have just a couple minutes before we go on break for 15 minutes. I'd love to hear from Joshua after I read this comment on who to follow on social media. But we had a great comment from Sylvester, who's from Trans Network Uganda. So thank you for joining us, Sylvester. And Sylvester says, thanks to Joshua and Kelly for those insights, really great. I wanted to ask, how do we ensure that trans people in countries like Uganda, where the law is silent about trans issues, reach where countries like South Africa and the USA? So how do you develop that advocacy like you see in South Africa? And how do we ensure collaboration that create trans resilience, even in countries, even where their laws are not favorable? Very good question, Sylvester.
Thanks, Sylvester, and thanks for joining. We did our masters together last year. It was a whole vibe. So I think that definitely our greatest power, our greatest strength is each other. One of the campaigns that kind of inspired me was one from about 2 years ago or so, when we couldn't get any donors to kind of give us money for binder distribution because they saw it as service provision and they only about kind of funding advocacy for it or whatever. And so really just a few trans men in different countries and different regions came together to raise the funds themselves from their communities. From New Zealand, the money was mainly raised in New Zealand and given to specifically to countries in Asia and to countries in and to organizations in this region to distribute, and we managed to reach and exceed our target, and get the material that our community needed to them. And currently, there's a discussion on whether we can start an African branch of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and it's activist-led with doctors that are allies. And even before that, with the Trans Health Conference, for example, there was a huge focus on training doctors outside of South Africa, specifically paying for sponsorships and for transport and accommodation for them to come here to learn, at the very least, the medicine, despite the environment, and to also set up kind of telemedical support to people who start their transitions here and then have to go home. So I think there are many different strategies that we can use alongside kind of partnering with human rights lawyers and looking at strategic litigation that we can engage in. But I think it really is about just connecting with each other and looking at the resources that we have between us and coming up with a plan, because I don't think it's going to come from kind of outside or anywhere else. Yeah.
I would, just to piggyback, I would love an opportunity to work on an international campaign in order to help marginalized countries that don't have the rights or don't have the activists or need to train their activists. I would love an opportunity to do something like that if the opportunity ever presents itself. I know they have like World's AIDS conference, things like that. Maybe a World Trans Conference, Trans Symposium, KU Medical Center. Could be in the works. You never know, because there are symposiums they have. Like I said, World's AIDS has a conference every year with the whole world gets together on the topic of HIV and AIDS. And I don't see why we can't do the same thing about the trans topic about trans and the same incidents to help countries like that. So that was a very good question. And I just pray that it can come to fruition one day, soon.
Super. Very great ideas presented. Is there anything else? We want to thank you for joining our symposium today. We appreciate it. And you gave us some great words of wisdom. You are both wonderful people. Keep up the good work that you do.
So now we are going to take a short break. It's 11:50 and our keynote presentation will start right at 12. So get up, stretch, grab something to eat, grab something to drink, and we will be playing a PowerPoint for the next 10 minutes. So we're not leaving. We are recognizing some leaders in this the field and in the space of transgender advocacy. So stay on, maybe just turn off your camera and get yourself something to, we'll see you in 10 minutes.